The throne room of the alien emperor was made of black stone that shimmered like glass. It was so large that a whisper could echo for minutes before fading away. Tall pillars reached up to a ceiling hidden in shadows. The air was cold, heavy and still, so still that people who entered often forgot to breathe. At the far end of the hall, the emperor sat on his dark throne. No one dared to stand too close to him. No one dared to look at his face for long. Some said his eyes burned like stars. Others said they were darker than the void itself. But everyone agreed on one thing. He was the most feared being in the galaxy. For years, the emperor had ruled with silence. He spoke only when he wished, and when he did, his voice made the air vibrate like thunder. It was said that his words could crush a man's mind if he spoke in anger. So no one spoke to him first. No one asked him questions. His court was full of whispers and trembling feet. The guards stood like statues, their armor shining under the pale light. Even they were afraid. Every step they took near the throne, every breath they took felt dangerous. Once a commander had dared to ask the emperor for forgiveness after a failed mission. The emperor did not answer. He only looked at the man, and the commander fell to the ground, dead. No one ever found out how. After that day, silence became the law, and so the palace was silent. The servants moved through its halls like ghosts. The advisors spoke only through small voice machines that carried words without sound. When they bowed, their heads almost touched the floor. When they left, they moved backward so they never turned their backs on him. The emperor himself seemed carved from stone. He sat for hours unmoving, his long cloak spreading across the steps like dark wings. Sometimes a faint hum could be heard, the sound of his power. His throne glowed with strange lights, alive with ancient energy. He had ruled for so long that no one remembered when he had first come to power. Some said he was not born but created. Others believed he had been a god once before turning into a ruler of flesh and anger. Outside his palace, whole worlds bowed to him. Armies followed his command without question. Yet even with all his power, there was something cold and empty inside him. Those who looked at him said his eyes held no life, only memory, like someone who had lost everything long ago. But no one would dare to ask him what he had lost. Each morning, the emperor watched the sun rise from the tall window behind his throne. The twin suns of his world painted the sky in red and gold. The light touched the edge of his crown but never seemed to reach his face. To him, beauty was just another thing that faded too fast. He ruled not for joy but for order. His empire was silent, peaceful, and afraid. In the lower halls of the palace, far from the throne, a maid scrubbed the floors. Her name was Rena. She worked quietly, keeping her eyes down, her hands rough from years of cleaning the same marble stones. She had learned to move without making noise. Everyone had. Her daughter, Mira, sometimes came with her, though she was not supposed to. A small, bright child with curious eyes, she loved to explore the endless corridors. Rena always warned her, never go near the throne room, never. But the child would ask, "Why not, Mama?" "Because that is where he sits," Rena whispered. "The one no one dares to speak to." Mira didn't understand why everyone was afraid. In her small world, monsters only existed in stories. How could a man who ruled so many people be so terrible? Still, she obeyed, most of the time. Far above them, the emperor stared into the distance. His thoughts were deep and old. He remembered the countless worlds he had conquered, the enemies he had destroyed. He remembered the peace he had brought through fear. Yet he felt no pride. The silence he had created was heavy and lonely. Sometimes when the wind moved through the palace halls, it sounded almost like laughter. The emperor would close his eyes then as if listening to ghosts, but when he opened them again, only silence remained. In the galaxy beyond, fleets of ships carried his name, his symbol, his command. Planets bowed. Civilizations trembled. Yet inside that great palace, inside that heart of power, there was only one truth. The emperor was alone, and no one dared to speak to him. But fate, as silent as he was already moving. In a few short days, the quiet halls would echo with something new, something small, something sweet, something that would change everything. A voice, a smile, and a cookie. In the lower parts of the emperor's great palace, far away from the shining throne and dark halls, life was different. The air there was warm, filled with the smell of soap, steam, and metal polish. The workers spoke in whispers, their voices small and careful, as if even the walls were listening. Among them was Rena, one of the cleaning maids. Her hands were always red from scrubbing, and her back ached from bending over marble floors all day. But she never complained. She had someone she needed to care for, her daughter, Mira. Mira was only 8 years old, but she was unlike anyone else in the palace. While others walked with fear, Mira walked with wonder. She loved to follow her mother through the long corridors, asking questions about everything she saw. "Who lives behind that door?" she would whisper. "No one you need to meet," Rena would answer softly. "What about that big statue?" "That's a warrior from long ago." "Now hush, child." Mira would nod, but her eyes would keep wandering. To her, the palace was a giant maze full of stories waiting to be found. One evening, after her work was done, Rena brought Mira along because there was no one to watch her. The night shift was always quiet. Only a few guards and machines moved around. Rena told her, "Stay close. Don't touch anything. And never go past the golden door." Mira nodded, clutching a small cloth bag in her hand. Inside were a few cookies she had made herself that morning, using old ingredients her mother found in the kitchen's leftovers. They were not perfect. Some were too hard, some too soft. But to Mira, they were treasures. She wanted to give one to her mother later, maybe to make her smile. But as they walked through the halls, Mira's curious eyes caught something glowing far ahead. A light that shimmered like starlight. It came from beyond the golden door. The golden door was tall, carved with strange marks that moved faintly when touched by light. 2 armored guards stood on either side, silent as statues. No one ever went through unless ordered by the emperor himself. Mira had heard stories that behind it lay the great throne room, where the alien emperor sat in eternal silence. "Mama," she whispered, tugging on Rena's sleeve. "What's behind that door?" "Nothing for you," Rena said quickly, her face pale. "Don't look at it. Keep walking." But the more she was told not to look, the more Mira wanted to see. Later that night, when her mother was busy scrubbing the upper hallway, Mira slipped away. Her small feet made no sound. The palace was so large that her footsteps were swallowed by the quiet. The lights flickered as she crept closer and closer to the golden door. The guards were gone, perhaps changing shifts, perhaps following other orders. The hall stood empty. The glow from the cracks around the door looked like trapped sunlight. Mira's heart beat fast. Her mother's warning echoed in her mind, but curiosity pulled her forward like a string. She reached out, touching the cool metal of the door. It was smoother than she expected and warm, almost alive. Then slowly, it opened. The air that came out was cold and heavy, carrying the smell of stone and power. Inside, the chamber stretched endlessly, lit by strange floating lights that hovered in the air like silent stars. And at the far end of that endless hall, she saw him, the alien emperor. He sat on his dark throne unmoving. His body was tall and strong, covered in armor that seemed to grow out of his skin. His crown floated just above his head, spinning slowly like a ring of fire. His eyes were closed, but Mira could feel them. She could feel him, like a storm waiting to wake. For a moment, she forgot to breathe. The room was so quiet that even her heartbeat sounded loud. She took a small step forward. Then another, and then the cookie in her hand slipped. It fell to the floor with a soft sound, a tap, tiny but sharp. The emperor's eyes opened. 2 glowing circles of gold and black turned toward her. Every light in the room flickered. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Mira froze. She could not run. She could not hide. Her small body trembled as those eyes looked into hers, not with anger, not with hatred, but with something deeper. Something she could not name. The emperor slowly raised his head. His voice, when it came, was low and deep, echoing through the hall like distant thunder. "Who," he said, "dares to enter my silence?" And before Mira could speak, before she could even blink, the entire palace seemed to stop. The guards outside felt the ground shake. The stars above flickered. The emperor had spoken. After many years of silence, he had spoken again, because of one small girl and a cookie. The throne room was no longer silent. When the alien emperor opened his eyes, the air itself seemed to bow. The lights dimmed, the walls hummed, and a cold wind swept through the grand chamber, though there were no windows open. The guards outside froze. No one had heard that voice in years. Not one dared to breathe. and in the middle of that echoing space stood a small girl, trembling, wide-eyed, holding nothing but crumbs of a fallen cookie in her tiny hand. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then slowly, the Emperor rose from his throne. His armor shifted with a deep metallic sound, each movement heavy and precise. His crown of light burned brighter, and his gaze locked on the child before him. The two could not have been more different. The most feared ruler in the galaxy, and a child so small she barely reached his knees. Yet in that moment, they were the only two beings in the universe. Mira wanted to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. Every story she had ever heard about the Emperor rushed through her mind. That he destroyed planets with a thought, that he killed anyone who looked at him. But his eyes were not what she expected. They were not full of rage. They were not cruel. They were tired. They glowed like dying stars, old and sad, filled with memories of too many battles, too many broken worlds. He took one step toward her. The floor shook under his weight. Mira stumbled backward, clutching her empty hands close to her chest. "What are you?" His voice was deep and slow, as if unused to speaking. "Why do you stand before me?" Mira swallowed hard. I'm sorry," she whispered. "I dropped my cookie." The Emperor blinked. The hall trembled again, but softer this time. Like the palace itself was confused. "Cookie," he repeated, the strange word rolling through the room like a secret. "You entered the Chamber of Silence. For food?" She nodded weakly. "I didn't mean to. The door. It opened." For a moment the Emperor said nothing. The lights in the room flickered, and his eyes glowed brighter. Every guard outside waited for the sound of thunder, the sound that meant death. But instead the Emperor lowered his gaze. His voice grew quieter. "No one has entered this room uninvited in centuries," he said. "Even my generals kneel from afar, yet you walk in like it is a garden." Mira tilted her head, confused by his words, but not feeling his anger. She took a small breath and said softly, "I didn't want to make you angry, mister." The Emperor stared at her. No one had ever called him mister. Entire planets called him your infinite majesty, the eternal flame, or the silent sovereign, but never mister. Something strange stirred inside him, something he had not felt in a long, long time. He knelt down slowly, his enormous form bending until his glowing eyes were level with hers. The ground cracked slightly under the weight of his armor, but his gaze softened. "What is your name, small one?" "Mira," she said in a whisper. "Mira," he repeated as if tasting the word. "Do you know who I am?" She nodded shyly. "You're the Emperor. Mama says everyone's scared of you." His eyes flickered. "And you?" he asked. "Are you afraid?" Mira looked down at her hands, then back at him. "A little. But you looked sad. Sad people don't scare me." The Emperor went still. Sad. No one had ever dared to say such a thing to him. Not his council. Not his generals. Not even the high priest who sang his name across galaxies. Yet this child said it like a simple truth. For the first time in ages, the Emperor did not know what to say. He looked at the crumbs on the floor, then at the girl again. "What is cookie?" he asked slowly. Mira blinked, surprised. "You don't know? It's sweet and round. I made them for Mama. They make you happy when you eat them." "Happy," he repeated, his voice almost a whisper. "I do not remember that taste." Something inside the Emperor cracked. Not his armor, but something deeper. A small warmth like light behind old glass began to stir. He raised a hand, and for a moment Mira thought he would strike her. Instead, his great metal palm opened. "Show me," he said quietly. "This cookie." Mira hesitated. Then from her small pocket she pulled out another one. It was broken on one side, but she held it out bravely. The Emperor looked at it as if it were a holy relic. Slowly he took it from her tiny hand. The guards outside could not believe what they saw through the half-open door. Their mighty Emperor, kneeling before a human child, holding a cookie. And then, for the first time in centuries, the silence of the throne room broke again. Not with thunder, not with screams, but with the faint, unbelievable sound of something no one thought they would ever hear from him. A sigh, soft, gentle, almost human. The alien Emperor had accepted the gift. The alien Emperor stared at the cookie in his massive hand as if it were a piece of a forgotten star. The little round thing looked so small, so fragile, soft brown on one side, cracked on the other, with a faint sweet smell rising from it. No one had ever given him a gift before. No one had ever dared. For a long moment he did not move. The air around him shimmered with his power, uncertain and restless. The guards outside could feel it, like the calm before a storm. Yet the storm never came. Instead, the Emperor looked down at Mira, who stood waiting, her eyes wide but hopeful. "You made this," he said at last, his deep voice shaking the air. "Yes," she whispered, "for Mama, but you can have it." His great claws twitched. "You give it to me?" Mira nodded. "Of course." You looked hungry. Hungry. It was such a simple word. But to the Emperor it struck deep. He had devoured galaxies, consumed light and time itself in battle. Yet never once had anyone spoken of hunger, not like this. Not with kindness. Slowly he lifted the cookie closer to his face. The smell was soft, strange, almost gentle. He hesitated, as if afraid that touching it might destroy it. Mira tilted her head. "You're supposed to eat it," she said, trying not to giggle. The Emperor blinked, puzzled. "Eat?" "Yes, like this," she mimed, taking a bite, crunching with an exaggerated sound. "See?" Something like curiosity flickered in his golden eyes. He raised the cookie to his mouth and took a careful bite. The sound echoed through the chamber, a simple crunch that carried farther than any battle cry. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then slowly his glowing eyes softened. His shoulders relaxed. His long fingers trembled. It was sweet, the taste was simple, sugar, flour, and love. But to him it was something far greater. It was memory. He closed his eyes. For the first time in centuries, the darkness inside his mind cracked open, and light slipped through. He remembered something. A long time ago, before the wars, before the silence. He remembered a woman's laughter. He remembered warmth, sunlight, and the sound of soft rain. And he remembered the smell. The same smell now rising from this small cookie. He had forgotten what happiness felt like. Now for a single moment he felt it again. When he opened his eyes, Mira was still there, watching him. "Do you like it?" she asked softly. The Emperor's deep voice shook slightly. "It is good," she smiled, a small, bright smile that reached her eyes. "Mama says cookies can fix anything. Even bad moods." He looked at her for a long time. "And you believe that?" "Yes," she said simply. "Because it's true." Something like laughter escaped him. Not loud, but low and strange, as if his voice had forgotten how to shape joy. The sound startled even himself. The lights above flickered brighter, responding to his shifting energy. Mira giggled. "You laughed." "I did?" "Yes, you did. You sound funny." The Emperor tilted his head, unsure whether to feel insulted or amused, but the child's joy was disarming. It wrapped around him like a gentle wind, softening the edges of his endless power. Outside the great hall, whispers spread quickly. The guards told the servants. The servants told the advisors. The Emperor had spoken. The Emperor had laughed. No one believed it. Yet deep inside the palace, it was true. The most feared being in the galaxy sat quietly with a little girl, holding a half-eaten cookie like it was the most precious thing in the universe. Mira looked around the vast throne room. "It's so big here. Don't you get lonely?" The Emperor looked up at the endless walls, at the silent statues and dark ceilings. He did not answer right away. "Lonely," he repeated softly. "Yes, perhaps I do." "Then you should talk to people more," Mira said simply. "That helps." He looked at her with something like wonder. No one had ever told him what to do before. No one had ever dared. And yet, from this small child, the words did not sound like disrespect when they sounded like truth. He nodded slowly. "Perhaps I should." Mira smiled again and reached into her pocket. "Here," she said, pulling out another cookie, slightly crumbled but still whole. "You can have one for later." The Emperor stared at it, then at her. "You honor me," he said quietly. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I just like sharing." And then, for the first time since the creation of his empire, the great alien emperor, destroyer of worlds, ruler of the stars, did something no one could have imagined. He smiled. It was small and uncertain, but real. The energy in the hall shifted, warmer now, alive. In that moment, the silence that had ruled his palace for centuries was broken, not by fear, but by kindness. Outside, the twin suns began to rise. Their light poured through the high windows, painting the throne in gold. The Emperor looked at it, then at the child. Perhaps, he said softly, the universe is not as empty as I thought. Mira grinned. See? Cookies fix everything, and the Emperor, for once, did not argue. When the taste of the cookie faded, silence returned, but it was no longer the heavy, fearful silence that had ruled the palace for ages. This silence was different, gentle, thoughtful, almost alive. The alien Emperor sat back on his throne, the half-eaten cookie still in his hand. His eyes, glowing gold and black, no longer burned with cold power. They looked distant, as if searching through 1,000 years of memory. Mira stood quietly before him, her little hands folded in front of her, unsure if she should speak. The great ruler who had once destroyed armies now looked lost in thought. He leaned back slowly. This feeling, he said in a low voice, I have not felt it in ages. What feeling? Mira asked softly. He looked at her, and for a brief moment the stars in his eyes dimmed. Peace. The word seemed strange coming from him, a man who had turned planets into ashes, who ruled by fear, who believed peace could only come through silence. Yet now that word tasted new on his tongue, like the cookie itself. He closed his eyes, and in the dark behind his lids memories came. He saw a world long lost, his home before the empire, before the wars. A place of oceans that glowed blue at night, of green skies and soft winds. There had been laughter there once. He saw a woman standing beside him, her face gentle, her hands covered in flour. She was baking something in a small kitchen made of stone and light. Her voice echoed faintly. Don't forget to smile when you serve them. Cookies taste better that way. He had smiled then, a young soldier before he became a king. But the wars came, and with them loss. His people were wiped out in the fires of endless conquest. He became emperor not by choice, but by the cries of survivors begging for a savior. He had promised them safety, and gave them silence instead. To protect them, he silenced all. To control peace, he killed it. And now, centuries later, a small girl with a cookie had reminded him of who he used to be. When he opened his eyes again, the present returned. Mira was sitting cross-legged on the floor, looking up at him without fear. What are you thinking about? She asked. My world, he said quietly. It is gone. Gone? Burned. Long before your people ever looked to the stars. His voice trembled slightly. I thought that by ruling others I could stop the same fate. But all I did was spread the fire. Mira frowned. That sounds sad? He gave a small nod. It was, she tilted her head. Then maybe you should stop spreading it. The Emperor blinked. Such simple words, so small. Yet they pierced deeper than any weapon ever had. He looked around his massive hall, the cold pillars, the silent guards, the lifeless walls. For the first time, he saw it as it truly was. Not a throne room, a tomb. A tomb he had built for himself. The warmth from the cookie still lingered on his tongue. He stared at the child again, a being of simple hope, from a world so small and fragile it barely existed on his maps. And yet her presence had done what galaxies could not, break his chains of silence. What is your world called? He asked. Earth, she said proudly. It's small, but Mama says it's full of life. You'd like it. Life, he repeated, his deep voice soft. I have taken so much of that. Mira stood up. Then maybe you can give some back. The Emperor tilted his head. How? Easy, she said, holding out her tiny hand. Start with one person. He looked at her hand, so small against his dark armor, and hesitated. His fingers twitched, unused to gentleness. Finally, he reached out, and his clawed hand touched hers. For the first time in centuries, someone touched him without fear. The lights in the chamber grew brighter. The air felt lighter. Even the guards outside felt the change, though they did not understand it. A connection was made between a child of Earth and the ruler of stars. The Emperor felt something spark deep inside his chest. Not anger, not power, something older, something human. He looked down at her hand in his, then at her face. Perhaps, he said slowly, there is still hope for this universe. Mira grinned. See? You're getting better already. And though no one would believe it, a quiet laugh escaped him again. The sound rolled through the great hall like warm thunder. For the first time since the dawn of his empire, the alien emperor remembered who he once was. Not a conqueror, Not a god, but a man who had once smiled, and loved, and shared cookies. The palace had never felt so strange. The air was no longer heavy. The silence that once crushed every sound now seemed thin, fragile, almost ready to break. The alien emperor sat on his dark throne, staring at his open hand, the same hand that had destroyed worlds, now carrying the faint warmth of a small human touch. He could still feel it. The echo of that moment with Mira lingered in him like sunlight that refused to fade. Around him, the guards stood at attention, unsure what to do. They had seen the impossible, their master laughing, speaking softly, even smiling. Whispers had spread through the palace faster than light. The emperor had changed, but no one dared to say it aloud. That night, he did not sleep. He walked through his silent corridors, his long cloak brushing against the marble floor. He passed through chambers filled with weapons, trophies of conquered planets, and statues of fallen enemies. Everywhere he looked, he saw reminders of what he had been, a ruler built on fear. He stopped before one of the great windows that looked out into the stars. 1,000 suns burned in the Black Sea beyond, each one belonging to his empire. They used to make him proud. Now they made him feel small. He thought of Mira's words. Maybe you should stop spreading the fire. Start with one person. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in centuries the stars felt cold. The next morning, when the twin suns rose above the horizon, the palace woke to a sound no one had heard before. A voice, the emperor's voice. Summon my generals, he commanded. The guards, shaking, obeyed. Minutes later, the vast throne room filled with armored warriors, their faces hidden behind dark helmets. They knelt before him, heads bowed low. My lord, one of them said carefully, why have we been called? The emperor looked down at them, his gaze calm but unreadable. Tell me, he said slowly, what do you fear most? The generals exchanged uncertain glances. None dared to answer. At last one spoke. We fear your silence, my lord. The emperor nodded almost sadly. As I feared yours? The hall grew tense. No one understood his meaning. He stood, his tall frame towering over them like a shadow of light. I built this empire from ashes. I gave it order, power, control, but in doing so I buried life itself beneath obedience. The general stiffened. Was this a test, a trick? From this day forward, the emperor said, his voice rising, no world shall burn in my name. No voice shall be silenced in my presence. The age of fear ends now. A murmur rippled through the hall, shock, disbelief, even fear. My lord, one general said, trembling, peace is weakness. The people respect strength. Then let them learn, the emperor said, his golden eyes glowing. That kindness can be stronger than terror. He raised his hand, and a beam of light swept across the room. The symbols of his past conquests, banners, weapons, trophies, turned to dust. The floor shone clean and bare. His voice echoed again, steady and powerful. Rebuild this empire, not with weapons, but with hands that heal. For a long time no one moved, no one spoke. The generals knelt deeper, unsure what they had just witnessed. Some believed he was mad. Others felt something stir inside them, something long buried. The emperor turned his gaze toward the doorway where a small figure watched from afar. Mira, clutching her mother's hand. Come forward, he said gently. Rena. The maid tried to pull her back, but Mira stepped forward bravely. Her small footsteps echoed in the vast hall until she stood before the throne once more. The generals stared in disbelief. A child in the chamber of command went unthinkable. The emperor looked down at her and said, This one reminded me of what I had forgotten. He turned to the others. From today, every voice, and even the smallest, will be heard in this palace. Mira smiled, and in that moment something extraordinary happened. The great chamber lights brightened, the air shimmered with color, and for the first time the throne room didn't feel cold. It felt alive. The emperor knelt once again before the child. You said cookies fix everything, he said softly. She giggled. Did it work? He nodded. More than you know. That day became legend. Across the stars, word spread like fire. Not of war, but of change. The silent ruler had spoken again, not to destroy, but to heal. Entire worlds stopped their fighting, waiting to see what would happen next. And in the center of it all, the emperor looked out upon his empire, his heart heavy with both sorrow and hope. He knew it would not be easy. He knew peace would take time, but he also knew this, and for the first time he would try, because a maid's daughter had offered him a cookie. And it had tasted like home. Years passed, and the stars began to whisper a different story. Across the galaxy, people no longer spoke of the alien emperor as a monster. His name, once feared, was now spoken with quiet awe. Some called him the listener, others the silent light. The old tales of terror slowly faded, replaced by songs of peace, and of a small girl who had changed everything with a single cookie. In the grand palace, things were not the same. The halls that once echoed only with fear were now filled with voices. Workers laughing, children running, and music playing during the evenings. The emperor's throne no longer stood high above the people. He had it moved down, closer to the floor, so that when others came to speak, they stood at eye level, and beside that throne, every morning, sat a small round plate with 2 cookies on it. Mira had grown taller now. Her hair was longer, her smile still bright. She no longer hid behind her mother's apron. She walked the palace freely as if she belonged there. Because in a way she did. To everyone, she was the child of change. The emperor had given her a place of honor, not out of power, but friendship. And though she never sought it, the people treated her like a legend even while she was still alive. Every week, Mira would visit the emperor's private garden. It was a place no one else dared to enter. But to her, it was just another room where stories lived. She would find him there, sitting under a great silver tree watching the twin suns rise. "Good morning, mister," she would say with her cheerful voice. He would look down and smile, a small, rare smile that he only gave to her. "You are early again, Mira." "I brought cookies," she'd reply, holding up her small basket. He would nod. "Then the day will be kind. But even peace cannot stop time." The emperor had lived for centuries before Mira was even born. His power kept him strong, but his heart, once frozen, was now warm, and warmth he found made him human again. Years rolled by like quiet waves. Empires changed. Worlds grew brighter. People no longer knelt in fear when he appeared. They bowed in respect. The stars, which once burned cold under his command, now twinkled like they were smiling. And through it all, Mira stayed by his side. As she grew into a young woman, she helped guide his new council, teaching them the simple lessons her mother had taught her: kindness, patience, and sharing. The empire began to heal, but one morning as the suns rose, the silver tree in the garden shimmered softly, and the emperor did not stand to greet her. He sat beneath the tree, eyes closed, calm and still. His armor glowed faintly, his crown of light slowly fading. Mira ran to him, her basket falling to the ground. "Mister, wake up! I brought cookies." For a long moment there was no answer. Then, as if hearing her voice across the veil of time, he opened his eyes one last time. "Mira," he whispered, his voice softer than ever. "I once ruled the stars, but you ruled my heart." Tears filled her eyes. "Don't say that. You're going to be fine." He smiled, the same gentle smile she had seen when she was a child. "You gave me what no army could, peace." His hand lifted weakly. "Promise me one thing." She nodded, holding his hand tight. "Anything." "Keep giving cookies," he said with a faint laugh. "The universe still needs them." And with that, the light around him began to glow, bright, warm, endless. It didn't burn. It felt like home. When it faded, only his crown of light remained, floating above the silver grass. The emperor was gone. His body turned into golden dust that sparkled like a new star being born. Mira fell to her knees, crying softly. But she smiled through her tears. "Goodbye, mister," she whispered. "You kept your promise." Centuries later, travelers spoke of a shining star near the heart of the galaxy, brighter than all others, glowing like a golden flame. They called it the Emperor's Star, and on a small planet called Earth, a story was told to children before bed, of a lonely ruler who once ruled through fear, of a brave little girl who offered him a cookie, and of how one small act of kindness changed the fate of 1,000 worlds. No one dared to speak to the alien emperor, until the maid's daughter offered him a cookie. And from that moment, the universe was never silent again.